Welcome to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. This week, as coronavirus spreads, we measure its strain on China's already stressed, debt-heavy financial system. And a huge fan of Trump's steel tariffs, well, he's now suing over them. Plus, we hear from former Lehman chairman Michael Ainsley on what he says is the story that's never been told about that bank's collapse. But first, Bernie Sanders' rise and Joe Biden's fall. Tyler Pager here for the latest from the campaign trail. Fresh from New Hampshire, on your way back to D.C. Appreciate you stopping here in New York. What'd you see up there?
Yeah, so the big story obviously is Bernie Sanders wins again. He won in 2016 and he continued that track record. He won by a smaller margin though, and I think the big story behind that is Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar kind of fighting to be that moderate alternative to Bernie Sanders. And then again, Joe Biden's collapse, finishing fifth in a distant fifth, not getting any delegates from that contest.
Right, and basically like saying peace out before the numbers were even tallied, heading to South Carolina. That's where it all hangs in the balance for him, it seems.
Right. They saw the writing on the wall and decided it's better to try to save face, go to where his stronghold is supposed to be in South Carolina, and start to build up the campaign there and kind of relaunch it as they prepare for that primary at the end of the month. That is his firewall, and it shows some cracks, but we'll see if he's able to maintain that lead and catapult him out of South Carolina into Super Tuesday.
What was the mood on the ground? How did people feel? What did they say was new or different here in 2020 than from 16 or even going back to 2008?
I mean, the biggest difference is just how big the field is and how big it remains. You think Iowa and New Hampshire are kind of these winnowing contests where people start to drop out after that. We saw a few people in the single digits drop out, but we still have a pretty large field heading on to these next two states of Nevada and South Carolina, and then into Super Tuesday. So I think obviously the biggest difference is it wasn't a binary contest between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. There were a lot of choices across the spectrum, both moderates and progressives that voters could choose from.
And life for Amy Klobuchar.
Exactly. She gets out of New Hampshire with some momentum. She's going to struggle a little bit because it's shown that she's not polling as well with voters of color, and she needs to build an organization that can capture this momentum she gets out of New Hampshire. But she gets life and lives to fight another day.
And meanwhile, the president sort of feasting on a lot of this discord.
Yeah, this is exactly what the president wants. There's no one clear front runner at this moment that the Democrats can rally behind and unite behind. And Donald Trump is excited about the prospect of facing Bernie Sanders. His campaign thinks that's the best person for him. He can paint him as a democratic socialist, which is what he identifies as, and really harness that energy against that kind of mindset and bring in moderates and independents into the fold.
All right, Tyler Pager headed back to D.C. We know you'll be on the campaign trail. A lot more to come. Thank you so much. All right, from D.C. to Hong Kong, we turn now to Tracy Alloway via Skype. She's got the cover story. It's all about fragile China. Tracy, thank you so much for joining me. So what is it like? We heard about the ground in New Hampshire. What's it like on the ground in Hong Kong?
Ooh, I gotta say, it feels slightly apocalyptic. You walk down these really busy streets in the middle of Hong Kong, and there's still people out and about, but far fewer than there used to be, and nearly everyone nowadays is wearing a face mask.
And Tracy, you understand the economics and the markets so incredibly well here. You know the history, and there is a sense, to the point of the cover, that China is fragile in a way that maybe none of us fully understand. Help us understand it.
Well, this has always been the big existential question about China and its role, not just in the world economy, but also in global financial markets. You know, people like the Trump administration, they tend to portray China as this big threat to the American economy, to the American worker. But there's also a line of thought that China is much weaker than many people actually think. And one area of weakness in particular has been the notion of debt and leverage in its financial system. We've heard people talk about this for years and years and years now. China's financial system relies heavily on debt-fueled growth. It's what they reach for whenever they have a slowdown in the economy, like back in 2008. We saw a lot of infrastructure spending. It's what they reach for really to develop their economy and get the standard of living up to where they want it to be in order to solidify the CCP's power. And of course, when you have growth that is driven by debt and by leverage, there is always a chance that it could take a hit and the whole edifice could come falling down.
And so in Hong Kong, we're not just talking about the financial system, we're talking about protests. And obviously, we're talking more and more about the coronavirus. Tie it all together for me. How worried are people that this could be the thing that starts to pull this apart?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things about being here on the ground in Hong Kong is that you are seeing this variety of opinion at the moment. Hong Kong is Asia's biggest financial center. You have a lot of people here who have basically tied their careers, their money, their lives to the growth of China and its integration into the world economy and financial markets. And now there seems to be a little bit of doubt creeping in as to whether that might happen to the extent or at the pace that a lot of people had expected or hoped that it would. The coronavirus outbreak really puts a question mark over the Chinese growth story. Now, what we're seeing from some fund managers is they're positioning for a big stimulus effort from the Chinese government. They're buying things like cement stocks, property stocks on the expectation that that's going to come. But some other people are getting pretty wary at this point. They think if China unleashes stimulus, they're not going to be able to do infrastructure spending like they did before. They're probably not going to be able to lower rates as much as they would have hoped because rates are already low. And again, you get back to that question of whether or not you can keep prompting additional economic growth through the use of additional leverage.
All right, huge questions. We know you're there to give us the answers. Tracy Alloway, thank you so very much. All right, for more on that and this week's issue, here's editor Joel Weber. Why put China on the cover? I mean, it is the story.
Yeah, we can't look away from it, and the coronavirus was the topic of the last week's cover story, but it was more about the science and the efforts to try and actually figure out, is there a way to actually combat global predicaments like this? But this week we really wanted to turn and look at China, where it's obviously the epicenter of what's happening. And it's less about the coronavirus than it is about all the various elements of the global economy that come back to China.
Right.
And something like the coronavirus starts to look like a potential spark that people have been worried about for a long time because of the complexity of the Chinese financial system.
All right, and we heard a lot about that from Tracy Alloway. I have to ask you about remarks as well, because pretty provocative, because it goes right to the heart of the rule, the lifetime rule, ruler for life, of President Xi. Tell us about the doctor and how he plays it.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting episode where the doctor who basically came out and said, Dr. Li said, hey, there's this thing, coronavirus, we should all be worried about, and basically kind of disappeared. And there's been many conspiracy theories about it, but online in China, there's been really like a rush to turn him into a martyr. And that martyrdom in the time of Xi is sort of what Dan Tinkate and Peter Martin talk about. China actually has a long history of martyrdom. So in many ways, the tension that we're starting to see is sort of a grassroots level distrust of the official dialogue from Xi and the Chinese apparatus about the coronavirus, which is yet another one of these interesting elements of tension and why we made this.
Joel Weber, thanks a lot. Up next, more on the coronavirus and its impact on Chinese manufacturers, plus the coalition that's searching for a cure. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly. Join us for Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio, starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. Also, catch up on our daily show by checking out our podcast. And you can find us online at businessweek.com, on our mobile app, and you can watch us every day on YouTube. Well, let's get back to our top story this week, the coronavirus. Across China, thousands of manufacturers, they are in limbo, waiting to hear when they can resume operations. Here's editor of the economics section, Christina Lindblad, on the economic impact.
That province, Hubei, is important to China's economy. It's about the GDP of that province alone is bigger than Poland's, but that province is not a big exporter onto itself. So what we looked at in our story is what is happening to China's industrial heartland, which is more on the East Coast. And there, it's been freezing. Like the disruptions are just sort of, like radiating through the country and then internationally. So at one point last week, 70% of China's productive capacity was offline because authorities had not allowed company owners to reopen. Now, we've been seeing this week gradually some places start to say you can go back to work. Of course, that is not possible for every company because a lot of them have their workers are stuck in their home counties because they went home for the Lunar New Year holiday and then faced quarantines and then travel bans. So even if today, local authorities said, it's okay, go back to work, because I think there is now this push in China to normalize, at least economically. It may be that we talked to one company, 90% of its workers are from other provinces.
Wow. And remind us of the geography here. You mentioned it briefly, but we're talking about the Pearl River Delta, right? I mean, this is global supply chain, practically like global headquarters of global supply chain in many ways.
Pearl River Delta and a little bit wider, but yes, these are companies that are very embedded in global supply chains, which is not always the case for, the companies that are in the epicenter of the outbreak. So, I mean, there was a company we talked to in India that makes capacitors, and they were saying basically that they just haven't received any supplies from China that they need for parts. So they're going out to South Korean suppliers. But those companies also source from China, so their inventories are running down fast.
And so synthesize this with the trade war, because that was already sort of top of mind for the Chinese economy, obviously in the U.S. economy too, but there had already been, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of changes made to the supply chain to some extent in a positive way, in a negative way. Like, how do we sort of put all this together?
Well, my concern, and I think and economists are going to be looking at, and there's not as much clarity as there might be for big companies, is small and medium-sized companies in China, because obviously they just don't have the deep pockets that some of the national champions do. And so there was a survey that came out recently of almost 1,000, and the owners of these firms said that they couldn't sustain 3 months of the kind of situation that they've been experiencing in the last few weeks. And about a third said they expect to see half of their revenues wiped out this year. You have to remember that for certain types of companies, this happened at a crucial time of the year, which would be equivalent to, let's say, holiday shopping season in the U.S. There's no way to recoup those sales. They're not coming back, even if you were going to be able to open tomorrow. That's where a lot of people are sort of feeling their way. What is going to be the impact on China's economy? I think a lot of the thinking is, if this is kind of quickly contained, there is going to be a bounce back in the second quarter, and by the second half of the year, we'll see a stabilization.
Well, the coronavirus is also the first big test for SEPI, C-E-P-I. It's a little-known coalition that brings together pharma companies, governments, and other bodies to coordinate a response to crises just like this. Economics editor Peter Coy, always looking around the corner here with me in New York City. All right, so what is this? Where did this come from?
Well, back when we had the Ebola outbreak in 2014, governments had been working on funding a vaccine for the Ebola. It had been known about since the 1970s, but nothing had ever been done. No company had taken the baton and gone out and developed a vaccine because outbreaks are fairly rare. The people who would be vaccinated are quite poor, can't really afford a vaccine. So the private market just wasn't doing the job of protecting people from Ebola. So they looked at this and said, we're going to have other viruses striking. We need to have a plan. So at Davos, the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Switzerland in 2016, the idea was conceived. They went back to the drawing board, and then a year later went ahead with it. It's headquartered in Norway, of all places, which has had 0 cases of the coronavirus so far. So it's only 3 years old, 68 employees. So in one way, it's very small. In another way, it's very big because of its power to coordinate, as you said, a lot of different players. The research team community, that would include the boutique researchers on vaccines, as well as the big manufacturers who need to be able to work together, governments supplying funds, regulators, so that we can speed these new vaccines through the regulatory process. It's sort of like providing a needed coordination function.
Well, and what's so interesting, you point this out in your piece, is that there obviously is an element of this that is medical and biological. Yeah. This is largely organizational, right?
Precisely. You know, I actually liken it to sort of a societal immune response. In the same way the body produces antibodies against a virus,
I love it.
Society produces new structures to fight outbreaks.
Yeah. And so, and because of the world we're living in, those need to be pretty complex, those organizations, you know, pulling together all of those different elements that you describe. How optimistic are people that this is working or can work?
I talked to Dr. Richard Hatchett, the executive director for the article, and he's thinking now it'll take 12 to 18 months before a vaccine is ready. Mm-hmm. Sounds like a long time, except it used to be like a decade or more to create a vaccine. So this is like running a lot of processes in parallel that would normally be done one at a time, getting everybody on board, making sure there are no glitches, no hitches, everything happens. So it may not even happen that fast. He said he's almost reluctant to give a date because it could be wrong. But while that might seem like a long time, it's going to be too late for the people in this initial outbreak. If this coronavirus is as bad as some people fear it will be, the vaccine will be crucial for future outbreaks, or the possibility that this virus never goes away. It just becomes endemic in the population like the common cold.
Up next, why a cheerleader for Trump's steel tariffs is now suing over them. Plus, former Chairman Michael Ainsley on why he says Lehman Brothers was collateral damage. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly. You can also listen to Bloomberg BusinessWeek on the radio on Sirius XM Channel 119, also AM 1130 in New York, 1061 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C., AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital, and through the Bloomberg Business app. And you can watch us every day on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News. We turn now to a tale of one steel company that was very much in favor of Trump's tariffs until it wasn't. Here's my conversation with Joe Doe. He covers the commodity space here at Bloomberg.
Brian Grilly, the reporter who is the head byline on this, came to me a few months ago, maybe 3 months ago, and said, "Had you heard about this whole story?" I said, I have actually, and I had told him a year before I'd been sitting in a conference room in Chicago at an industry event, and John Hritz, the CEO of JSW Steel, was up there, and he basically said, I got $1 billion investment from corporate, which is back in India for JSW Steel, essentially because of the Trump administration passing these tariffs, and I could not be happier about the tariffs. Flash forward.
He did everything short of like wearing a MAGA hat at that point, right?
Pretty much, right? I mean, listen, John's a straightforward guy. He will tell you he's a supporter of these tariffs. He's a supporter of the president. He's been in photo ops with the president many times before. Fast forward to August, and we get a thing on the wire that says that they're suing the Trump administration. And Brian says, we got to write this story.
Yeah. So how do you unpack something like, I mean, you just pick up the phone and call this guy? What happened?
Yeah, the first thing I did was I actually had run into him recently and said, I'd like to chat with you more about this case if you have the time. And, we had a trouble kind of getting to him. And finally, after various calls and, jumping through various hoops, they said, come on down and see us in Mingo Junction out in Ohio. And so we did that right before the holiday break. We sat down with John. He told us what was what. He ran us through everything and said, listen, it's basically we're putting in new facilities. We're putting in new mills. We're investing $1 billion, or we're hoping to invest $1 billion so that we can be self-sufficient making steel slabs and turning them into pipe. Down in Baytown, those pipes obviously would be supplied to the energy industry.
Yeah.
So they thought in the meantime, they could just import the slabs from their parent company in India. And ultimately, the Commerce Department said, no, we're not going to let you do that. And so you get their argument, right? They're like, well, we're investing this money because the whole point of the tariffs was to do that. And in the meantime, so we're not losing money, we'll be able to import for free. And a big part of that is they're saying they're actually losing money right now because they're paying the tariffs to import,
right?
Which means that $1 billion investment is looking down more at the $350 million investment. And there's serious questions as to whether or not they're actually going to follow through with all of the build out that they were going to do at these two mills in Texas and in Ohio.
What's the argument on the government side?
Well, the government's saying, listen, we wrote it in stone. You get tariffs if you're importing foreign steel, and we've had enough steelmakers in the United States say they can supply you with the slab in the meantime.
Right.
So they had been filing these exemptions to the Commerce Department, and companies like Nucor and U.S. Steel, who we know very well, were saying, actually, Commerce Department, we can supply them with what they need. Of course, JSW Steel saying it's not that easy. You know, they're saying they have far more steel they can supply than they actually produce in a year. And that's where you kind of get in the back and forth. It's, well, do you believe, you know, is Nucor and U.S. Steel, are they actually able to supply these guys? And what kind of price are they actually able to get from them? And is the Commerce Department maybe understaffed, right?
Yeah.
Are they actually looking at all of these cases? I mean, this has been a huge question, not just for steel. This has been anything related to tariffs. Is Commerce equipped to handle each individual exemption that we're seeing in the market? I mean, totally unrelated to this story, we know that in the aluminum market, there were a lot of exemptions put in that nobody said and nobody tried to knock down.
Right.
And so Commerce started giving check marks to all of them, and the catch was that the amount of aluminum that was being asked for in a lot of cases was larger than the entire market in the United States. So it all just kind of intertwines, and we found that this story was just one really good example of showing how there are unintended consequences that really weave us in ways that maybe people aren't thinking of.
Well, and also a reminder, and I think this is true, keep me honest, that with a company like JSW, it's a reminder that it's not so clear. It's like, this is an American company or this is an Indian company. This is a multinational company in many ways. And that adds a level of complexity here as well.
Absolutely. And that is the complexity of so many of these markets, right? It's, well, we're an Indian-based company, but we have hundreds of people that we employ in the United States. There's a Russian pipe maker that we have mentioned in here as well, who is the same situation. They're like, you know, we're essentially an American company. Sure, we're owned by, a Russian conglomerate, but at the end of the day, these jobs that we have are in the United States. They're American people. And listen, that's where all of this gets very hairy. And really, at the end of the day, is kind of up to the reader or up to, really, in this case, the government or the law to determine what's what or what they think about it.
And for more on steel jobs in the U.S., that's obviously at the core of all of this. Here's Kaylee Lyons. She's got a chart. Hi.
Hi, I do. I'm looking at steel and aluminum mill employment and really just how that has changed since Trump's tariffs were enacted back in March of 2018. For a while, those tariffs did have the intended effect. Steel jobs were picking up, reaching a peak of near 88,000 in July of 2019. But then, of course, we had that global manufacturing slowdown. That was a big hit to steel demand, and as a result, steel prices, meaning many U.S. steelmakers really had to cut back. And now jobs have fallen about 3,000 from that July peak, and that brings the net gain from when Trump enacted those tariffs in March of 2018 to now to just 3%.
Well, and I love this chart in part because it really speaks to something that was clear in Joe's story, which is this is complicated. It's not a straight line in any way. And this whole drama around jobs, not over yet, right?
It's not over yet. You have companies the likes of U.S. Steel planning even more job cuts, and that's going to erode the job gains we've seen even further.
Kaylee Lyons, thank you so much. Up next, a conversation with former Lehman chairman Michael Ainsley. He's got a new book. It's called A Nose for Trouble. He says Hank Paulson probably won't like it. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly. Still ahead, has loose monetary policy made global central banks too complacent? And household size in the U.S. is not what it used to be. We've got the numbers. Plus, climbing Mount Everest without the long flight and all that altitude sickness. But first up, former Lehman chairman Michael Ainsley, he's got a new memoir. It's called A Nose for Trouble. He was one of 10 people in the Lehman boardroom on the evening of September 14th, 2008. He saw firsthand the events that led to the largest bankruptcy filing in U.S. history.
There's a whole story about Lehman that's never been told. We were muzzled as directors for 5-6 years by the lawyers saying we couldn't talk. And I have views on that, the rest of that story.
Well, Jason and I were going through the galleys, and I think both of us were like, all right, where's the Lehman part? Because I do think you were in the room where it happened, when it came to the vote on whether or not Lehman should file for bankruptcy. Take us there.
It was incredibly scary. It happened so fast. We thought the Fed would continue to lend to us. We thought there might be a merger. And yet that weekend, it became clear the government was backing out. They were not going to do their job as a lender to financial institutions. And the biggest bankruptcy in world history was facing us. We considered not doing it. We said, let's see if they'll really flinch.
Right.
Will they lend tomorrow morning if we don't declare bankruptcy?
What a terrible game of chicken to be playing.
It was, if we had said no and they had said no, we'd probably all not be here right now. It would have been awful.
And so as you've had time to both think about it yourself, obviously you put a lot of it down in the book, as you've had a chance to talk to other people, what were those sort of catalytic moments, both in your boardroom and in Washington, that ultimately led to the fate of Lehman?
Well, Hank Paulson will not like my book, but he's got a tough skin. First of all, it was Bernanke's decision. The Federal Reserve is supposed to lend to financial institutions. They abdicated and turned it over to Paulson. Paulson made a political decision. It was not an economic decision. It was not based on Lehman's collateral. There was plenty of collateral there. I want to promote not only my book, but this book. This is by Lawrence Ball, the Dean of Economics at Johns Hopkins.
Right.
This is the ultimate book about the Lehman bankruptcy. It's 200 pages of data and very, very thoughtful prose about what went on. And I really recommend that anyone that's serious about financial history take a look at Larry Ball's book. He's a very, very good scholar. In any event, we were left with no alternative. Did you realize that in the last week of Lehman's existence, our clearing bank, JP Morgan Chase, demanded and got $8.6 billion of our cash collateral to shore themselves up against Lehman possible losses? Well, they had the right to do that. Apparently, the fine print of their loan agreement let them do that, because we lost that lawsuit 4 years later. However, it drained the liquidity out of Lehman. We were solvent until literally 3 or 4 days before the bankruptcy.
So why did it happen to Lehman? Why was Lehman the one firm that was allowed to fall?
Here's my explanation. We all know that AIG was much bigger than Lehman. If they had gone under, the world would have changed. AIG owed Goldman Sachs billions and billions of dollars for various commitments. In my belief, Paulson said, I can't get both done. I can't save Lehman and save AIG, and if I can only save one, I'll save AIG. And I think we were collateral damage. We had done nothing wrong. That's why nobody went to jail. The examiner's suit, the bankruptcy examiner said there's no colorable crime here, no colorable violation by either management or the board. But when the Fed closes its window, you can't function.
As a businessman, as a very successful businessman, as a human being, what do you take away from it? What do you internalize that either changes your worldview, changes your view of the financial system, changes your view of maybe the next crisis?
Less leverage. All the banks, and we were right there with them, we were too leveraged. More equity.
So that's been a good thing coming out of the financial crisis.
I think it is.
And we should not be rolling back those regulations.
No. However, The Fed's ability to act has been severely restricted by Dodd-Frank. For example, and I only recently learned this, any refinancing that the Fed approves now has to be approved by the Secretary of the Treasury, which makes it back to politics.
Right.
I don't think that's a good rule. The Fed should focus on the banking system, not on the politics of the moment.
What about as a human being? What do you take away from it? Because that is a harrowing experience, as harrowing probably as anything from a financial or a business perspective that anyone's gone through in our lifetime.
You see those people carrying their boxes out. Like it's hard not to have an impact, right?
It's, you realize how many people were affected.
Yeah.
And I studied economics. I love the field, and that's why I became a real fan of Lawrence Ball. He has done a study of the post 10 years after Lehman, of the 23 countries of the OECD. The growth rates in those countries are still dramatically suppressed because of the Lehman bankruptcy. It's still hurting our world. Why do you think the German bond, 10-year German bond, is selling at minus 0.6 or whatever it is?
It's negative.
Negative yield. The world's economies have not recovered today, 12 years later from the Lehman bankruptcy. That's why I think it was a huge policy mistake. I think Paulson should have fought to save, at least for the moment, wipe out all the equity holders, dilute, don't give the shareholders anything or next to nothing, but don't let this company go into bankruptcy.
And you can hear much more from Michael Ainsley. He was also the CEO of Sotheby's. He's got a lot of great stories. We did all of that in our conversation that you can find on our Business Week Extended podcast. We call it the Business Week Extra. Well, staying with finance, a story in this issue about the mutual fund and index fund giant Vanguard. They're getting into the private equity business, isn't everyone? Here's reporter Annie Massar.
Vanguard announced plans to make its first real foray into private equity with a fund that's going to be managed by an outside firm called HarborVest Partners.
All right, this feels like a big deal. It feels like this is one of the holy grails on all sides of this, which is more people getting into what has largely been a pretty exclusive club. Why do they want in?
Holy Grail is exactly the right way of describing it, I would say. I think if you're Vanguard, you see that there's so much more focus on private markets. Recently, fewer companies are going public now, and you can frankly earn higher fees in that area. So if you're Vanguard and you're a big index fund provider and you typically compete on costs, they see a window where they can compete on costs for PE funds while still earning higher fees on those funds than they would on cheap index funds.
All right, let's talk about that, because the fees, you start to get into one of the most interesting aspects of all of this at a time, and you know this better than anyone, where fees are going down, 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 all the way to free. We're talking about an industry where the fees are, by most accounts, pretty extraordinary. 2 and 20 is the way that private equity funds, as you well know, charge 2% annual fees, 20% of profits. That seems like mind-blowing in the world of low fees. How do they square all that?
Yeah, compare that 2 and 20 to a cheap S&P 500 tracking fund that might just charge 3 basis points, and that's it. So, I mean, there's obvious appeal on the fee side for a firm like Vanguard. They will, first of all, only offer this to institutions in the beginning phases, smaller institutions like endowments and nonprofit foundations, but their aspirations are clear to bring this to a wider audience, and they might be able to do that through their advisor channels. They've got a growing network and a huge network of advisors who could eventually, if it were allowed, bring these kinds of investments to their clients.
And so this isn't the first time that a big money manager has sort of flirted with this idea, right? Remind us of the history here.
Yeah, actually, I mean, going back to around 2001, Vanguard itself tried to make a push into private equity, bringing in Hamilton Lane for a fund of funds. And in the fallout from the dot-com bust, they just abandoned that effort, and they said that they couldn't raise enough assets for it. But you've also seen BlackRock, again, World's biggest asset manager, $7 trillion in assets. 2/3 of that comes from its index product suite. They've also made a bigger push into alternatives and private equity specifically. They launched this fund called Long-Term Private Capital that takes stakes in private companies about 2 years ago. Now, that could be seen as a cautionary tale in some ways because it hasn't progressed as quickly as they initially said it would. So that shows some of the struggle for an outsider trying to get into private equity, such a relationships-based kind of arena.
Right. And it's interesting to think about where the private equity industry was in 2001, and they were probably dealing more with smaller private equity funds, maybe some venture capital, obviously, which got burned in the aftermath of .com. As you said, you fast forward to now, the private equity industry, you point this out in your story, has $1.5 trillion or so just in dry powder, $3-4 trillion in total assets under management, names like Blackstone and KKR and Carlyle. At the same time, those names, the Blackstones and the Carlyles, they're trying to get to some of these same investors. How is that going in terms of getting to the retail holy grail?
That's right. So you're seeing this real convergence. At the same time that Vanguard is trying to sneak into private equity, the Blackstones and KKRs are trying to see how they could get their private equity vehicles into the hands of more investors, more retail investors even.
Coming up, will those rosy days of inflation ever return? And to feel pain is to feel alive? Heavy. One Business Week reporter scales Everest, but he only has to go to Vermont. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly. Join Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio, starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by checking out our podcast. Also find us online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app. And you can watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News. Well, inflation remains subdued in the U.S. and most of Europe, and that has some investors warning that loose monetary policy has made global central banks too complacent. Here again is the editor of the economics section, Christina Lindblad.
Well, I think a lot of it was a great deal of attention paid to the comments that Ken Griffin, the founder of Citadel Hedge Fund, made at the Economic Club of New York last week, in which he said, we are totally unprepared for the return of inflation. And he's basically alluding to the fact that monetary policy in the U.S. and other places is so loose that it would be hard to quickly ramp up to contain, price pressures. And then some other people piped in saying, the death of inflation, is grossly exaggerated. Like, why are we writing these obituaries, So I think a lot of people are thinking they're not ready to write off the idea that there is inflation in the system, that this economic perennial thing, right? Then, though, there's a whole other camp that's poo-pooed this as sort of like this, almost like a New Year's tradition, one person said, to start the year saying, this year is going to be different. This is the year where we're going to see a return of inflation. And certainly, there are many factors that you could say would make this year actually be the one that we should be looking at, because we have in the U.S., in the U.K., very tight labor markets, and those have traditionally been, kind of precursors.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of other things going on, and one thing is the trade war, and the other one is coronavirus, and those two are disruptive to supply chains, which is another place where inflation can come up. I mean, if you're losing access to your regular suppliers, and all of a sudden, let's say in China, and all of a sudden you have to go to a South Korean company. Well, a lot of other companies may be knocking on that firm's door.
That's so your costs are going to go up.
Right. That's an opportunity for that company to put up prices.
Right. So that and the idea being that company puts up prices, and it sort of has this ripple effect where ultimately the prices of things just start to go up.
Right.
Finally.
But we're not seeing
But we're not seeing it yet.
Right.
And so let's go back to what you started with a minute ago, which is this idea of a tight labor market. We've been in a tight labor market now for, it feels like, a a pretty long time. How has that not played through yet? What do people say in terms of that lack of cause and effect that maybe we've seen thus far?
Well, I think, there is this kind of ritual now where the monthly job numbers come out and they're like gangbusters.
Yeah.
Once in a while they're not, but mostly, certainly the most recent one, surprise on the upside. So there's this, there's this like, wow, how is this not affecting prices? But, you have to remember that wage gains have come late in this more than
Very
10
late.
years.
They were essentially non-existent
right,
for a long
time. And they're not, and wages, are still not growing that strongly. Like in December, there was actually a blip in which we saw a break in this sort of trend in which they had been growing, modestly, right? So that's one factor. It also, it's like, it could be that companies are choosing to swallow, price increases from suppliers and sacrifice some margins. Although I haven't seen studies about how widespread that is. So in a world in which comparison shopping for all sorts of things is so easy, businesses are more reluctant, I think, to put up prices. Some people have alluded to this mentality that you have in Japan where like even convenience stores, are just completely freaked out by the idea of having to mark anything up because, people will just go to like the rival down the street.
Right.
So I think that mentality writ large, is a factor.
Well, back in the day, the American dream, it involved a house with a white picket fence and 2.5 children. Well, those days are long gone. Household size, well, it's not what it used to be. Here's this week's Business Week Explainer. Congratulations, America. You set a record. The Census Bureau estimates that the average U.S. household had 2.52 people last year. That's the lowest ever. And it's exactly half of what it was back in the 1880s. It's also about 25% less than the average during the baby boom. There's all sorts of reasons behind the shrinking of the American household. The country becoming more urban and less rural, people putting off marriage and childbirth, and the growth of one-person households. They've risen from 13% of the U.S. total in 1960 to 28% last year. It's happening elsewhere too. Possibly the world's smallest households, they're in Germany. They average just a hair under 2 people. But the shrinking may be coming to an end, at least in the U.S. The declines have been minimal in recent years. Adult children have been staying in their parents' homes or moving back, and unrelated people have been living together in greater numbers too. Up next, 23 miles and 29,000 feet in elevation. We take what's called the Everesting Challenge up in Vermont. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly. You can also listen to us on the radio on SiriusXM Channel 119, also AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C., AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital and through the Bloomberg Business app. And you can also watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News. A story in Pursuits this week. It's about scaling Mount Everest in Vermont. It's a different kind of hike with a different kind of Sherpa. Anders Mellon, he wrote about it after he went all in and took the trek.
He's a serial entrepreneur. He was a rapper early in his career. Then he founded a private jet company that Berkshire Hathaway bought in about a decade ago. And since then, he's been an investor. He's helped build and sell a couple of companies. And now he is a life coach.
Yeah.
And essentially runs a life coaching program. And this Everesting challenge is part of that.
All right, so take us to Vermont. What's entailed here? First of all, it costs $4,000.
It does. So it's a pretty penny just to go on a really long hike up a ski slope.
A really long series of hikes in many ways. All right, so you arrive and you sort of show up as like, I'm a reporter, I'm just going to sort of chat with people, but you're also a very accomplished athlete in and of your own right, so you got sucked in.
I did, yeah. I showed up in Stratton Mountain in Vermont where this event took place in October, which essentially entails that you hike up a ski slope. It's a black diamond ski slope, and then you take the gondola down, and then you repeat that 16 times, 17 times in total. And then by that time, the altitude that you've gained equals Mount Everest. So you've effectively climbed Mount Everest, but without the oxygen tanks. And
Right, 29,000 feet.
Yeah.
A little over.
Yeah.
Why? Why do people do this?
So that's what I asked dozens of them out there on the course. There were about 200 of us that did this over 36 hours. And everybody had a slightly different answer. Some people were there because many were mid-career and kind of felt a bit of a life crisis. But many just simply said that, I'm very accomplished professionally, and I like my life the way it is, but I don't really have these things when I get out and really test my limits physically. So one guy told me that, you almost have to manufacture these insanely hard things for yourself, and I think they sharpen you.
Right. And and this is of the moment in many ways. And you and I have spent a lot of time off air talking about our various pursuits in this regard. You're a very accomplished swimmer, runner, all of these different things. What was it like for you physically? You're in unbelievable shape. This was still pretty hard.
I used to be in good shape when I was still a swimmer, but that was years ago. But I showed up there, hadn't really planned on doing the whole thing. I figured I would scale 2-3 times with them and just get the feel for it. But then I showed up and realized that I was, out of the 200 participants, I was pretty much the youngest person there, and then felt compelled to,
those
get my act
competitive
together.
juices never quite leave you, do they, Anders? Yeah, absolutely.
So I was very underprepared in terms of equipment. It had rained and it was windy and cold, and I was wearing running gear and just a couple of sweaters and a beanie, but got a hold of a couple of ski poles and decided that, let's try it. And ultra events and ultra endurance events are a bit different than, even a marathon, where that it starts grinding on you after a while.
Yeah.
But it takes about roughly an hour plus for the average person to scale the mountain once. And then you do that 17 times, which means that it's a lot of time that you spend on your feet. So it's this low intensity exhaustion that builds up, that it just kind of, it wears you down over time.
Well, it sort of strips away everything, right? And that's part of the reason that people do it is we've all got all these things going on in our minds. We've got all these plans, all these feelings and emotions and whatnot, and there's really nothing in front of you except the mountain and the next step and the next step and the next step. That's part of the appeal.
Yeah, after a while it gets hard to really think about anything else but just one foot in front of the other, because you get so exhausted but you still got to keep going.
And it's not a race, or is it?
No. Like many endurance events, this is finishing is the goal. And everybody finishes at their pace and complete it at their own pace and in their own way. So which also brings out it creates a very supportive environment on the course, because you're not competing with other people. It's about finishing. And then everybody can rally around that and support each other.
Bloomberg BusinessWeek is available on newsstands now, also online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app. And check out our daily Business Week podcast as the best of each show every day. And you can watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News. More Bloomberg Television starts right now.